somebody is typing furiously there in the background.
Oh, that's me.
Well, he's muted now, so. It's 7:05 there, Padraig. Do you want to?
Okay, look, so we will start, and we'll run through this as fast as we can, and hopefully then we'll have a decent opportunity to have questions and answers, or questions and comments, or questions and whatever diatribe session afterwards, and we'll take it from there. So thanks very much, Kathy, for chairing this evening. And basically what we hope to do tonight is to look at the First World War, not from the perspective that we usually look at it. And I've chosen this slide here very much because I think the debate in Ireland has been very much about lilies and not wearing lilies, and about not lilies, poppies are not poppies, and who should wear them and who shouldn't, and what it says. And I think it's a bit like who saw the first cuckoo, sort of set of letters to the Irish Times each year. You can almost be certain that the same debate will happen about poppies. And it really says more about the state of Anglo-Irish relations than it does about the First World War at any given time. So if we look at the First World War and think about it, and think about what we learned about it in our history, certainly if we're maybe all the time it's been taught, but I think we were taught a certain number of things. One is that essentially it was a European war, that it was a white man's war by and large, and we can see here, I mean, this is the Imperial War Museum, like Faces of World War I, and like we're looking at white faces from beginning to end. I don't see any people from Africa there. I don't think, well, see one person in a turban. So like it's quite a distorted picture actually of what happened in the First World War. And I think also just before we look at that, is to look at the map of the world. Now it's not the sort of the largest map or the most clear map, because it's a trading map. But I think if we look at the pink sections there, like Canada, Australia, Southern Africa, whole big tranche here of East Africa, and bit down here then in Southwest Africa, all belonging as part of the British Empire, of course, as well as the Raj over here. France stuck here, but a massive chunk of North Africa here. The only bit that sort of stuck out in the side here is a bit that Spain controlled, and this color here is the sections there that Portugal owned, Mozambique and Angola, and then we had the German pieces here that had what became Togo and what became Cameroon. But the ones that would be interesting to us really in the First World War are down here, Southwest Africa, which was, as then was German Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, and German East Africa, which became Tanganyika, and we would now know as Tanzania. And there's a big swipe over here. Then obviously was the Ottoman Empire. Sorry, that's the Ottoman Empire down there. There, like anyhow. So the world was a colonially controlled world, and like in the entire of Africa, at that state, the only country that wasn't colonized was Ethiopia. But I mean, the First World War, the numbers involved were huge. Like Russia ended up with 12 million people mobilized. France, 8.4 million. Great Britain, almost 9 million people. Italy, with the United States, huge numbers of people mobilized. And I think one of the things you have to wonder, like in the population of the time, like the United Kingdom had less than 50 million people. So like if you're looking at 8.5, almost 9 million people, only men were allowed to join the army. So you more or less split the population in two. And then if you take out the very young, the very old, the infirm, and those who are essential workers, you're looking at a percentage of that 9 million is about 35% of the entire male population and over 60% of the eligible male population. And like when we think of where the war was, not only was there the war in the Western Front, which is sort of what is commonly spoken about, but obviously there was the war on the Eastern Front. Now, apart from sending an expeditionary force to Russia after Brest-Litovsk, that didn't affect sort of Britain or France. And there was a war in North Africa, and there was a war in East Africa, and then there was the war in Mesopotamia. So like we have to ask, we'll say, especially France and Britain, how did they mobilize over 17 million people between them? And the answer is that they didn't do it from their own resources. They did it from the resources of empire, and that they realized from the very beginning that they had to rely on their empires. And if we look here, like, very early on, that's just one of like there are very many British recruiting posters designed for the empire. The recruiting posters in England, I think we know, sort of the traditional sort of Colonel Blimp, type poster. But this is very much rally around the flag, men of the empire needs you, your country needs you. And down here on the bottom, another 500,000 men required at once. So that shows you the demand on the empire. And I think what's important as well to note is that even though like the empire was obviously huge, like there was like, the percentage of people in the world that were part of the British Empire is incredible. Looking at the figures at that time, but there was a racism about how they approached the empires. And in the first instance, obviously they looked to the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Ireland. And then they looked essentially to the settler colonies. And for the Western Front, for the main, originally they only wanted white soldiers, even from the settler colonies. So like, there's over 5 million troops from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Then we have Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And that adds up to about another just over 1 million. And then 1.2 million soldiers from India that we hear very little about. What wasn't included in these figures early on was the contribution of the West Indies, their contribution and the West Indian Regiment to the First World War, and more particularly what was excluded was the King's African Rifles, which was a very large army, which ended up fighting in German East Africa. And the war in German East Africa actually lasted a fortnight longer than the war in Europe. The other thing just interesting to look at here is the question of conscription. Because at the beginning, first year, second year, running into the beginning of 1916, the early enthusiasm for war continued on. It did in Britain, and then around 1916, the volunteers began to, that flow of volunteers began to dry up. People who were enthusiastic, who weren't enthusiastic at the beginning, they didn't become more enthusiastic as the war went on, by and large. So the flow of volunteers from Great Britain and from the colonies began to dry up. So what you had was you had conscription. Now Britain, apart from in the United Kingdom itself, was not in a position to enforce conscription. But it did ask the colonial governments in the different areas to enforce conscription. So in Canada, there was a major parliamentary row about it. On the first ask, it failed, but Canada did bring it in. In New Zealand, it was brought in without too much of a fuss. In South Africa, there wasn't conscription for white soldiers, but there was conscription for the Africans, for the Labour Corps. And in Australia, the government brought it to a referendum twice, and they lost both times. And in the second referendum, they lost more substantially than in the first referendum. So that the enthusiasm for war that obviously was there in the beginning and give you this massive volunteer army at the beginning of the war, very much began to wane as the war went on. But even with that, the still between conscription and volunteers, like you're still talking about a huge army. In India, the situation was different in that there wasn't conscription, but local rulers and both local British commanders and local sort of Indian sub-rulers were essentially given quotas that they had to fill. So that like it wasn't said that everybody between the ages of 18 and 25 had to join, or 18 and 35, as you had in Britain. There was a general conscription from 18 to 45, I think. But that didn't exist in India. But in the different areas, there was a quota to be filled. But even in that, you had a racism. In that, and the French were guilty of it as well. We'll deal with the French later. But say, for example, the British regarded certain peoples and tribes and areas in India as being more manly, being more warlike. Like they would have regarded Kashmir and that area as being the most sort of manly, warlike tribes. So even though Kashmir makes up quite a small portion of what was the Raj, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh at that time, a completely disproportionate number of the soldiers came from there. And obviously, we all know of the situation of the Gurkhas, in both the First World War and the Second World War, and I suppose even their treatment right to the present day. Indians were unusual for colonial troops in the sense of non-white colonial troops, in that they actually did fight in Europe. Not many of them in the great scheme of things, like out of the 1.2 million. Not a whole pile, but they did fight. They were there from the very beginning because there was a certain amount of standing army of Indians, and we can see there Indians, troops having been wounded in France in 1914, and Indian infantry marching in France again quite early in the war. Of course. The Indian soldiers were given lower pay, worse treatment after the war, and worse sick benefit, worse everything, and of course worse duties during the war. But and again, it's a history that the Indians, for various reasons, to an extent, wrote out their own history. But we can see there that obviously some people within India aren't prepared to take that anymore, and it's quite a powerful image, superimposed on the image of the poppies all around the Tower of London from 2014. So the West Indians, they had about, it's a small population, but they did have, I think, about 35,000 troops. They were very badly treated. For example, when they enlisted, they were brought in via Nova Scotia, which I'm not sure why they were brought through Nova Scotia. But quite a lot of them died en route. Some of them froze to death because they weren't properly, they didn't have the proper clothes for transport. But those who died en route weren't given and their families weren't given the benefit of had there been a soldier who died, because the Ministry for Defence and the Treasury said they haven't enlisted, so they weren't soldiers, so you're not getting the benefit. It's not the benefit of being a soldier when you died. You were just on your way to the recruiting office. They thought they were soldiers. I'm sure if that started a mutiny, they would have been dealt with as mutinying soldiers. But I think it just shows you that the mealy-mouthedness and the racism. That these people who were colonial, who were subjects, coming to fight, as they saw it, for England, for their country, and that's the way they were treated. It's also interesting in the West Indian situation that the debate in the West Indies, amongst the sort of the political class, the political elite, almost echoed exactly what was happening in Ireland with Redmond and that sort of group of people at that time, in that if we fight for England, and if we show we are good citizens, and if we show we are responsible, then we will be rewarded, and we will be trusted with our own government. So it's almost like moving the debate, which was happening, or partly happening in Ireland, amongst the volunteers, to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. It's not sort of germane to what we're doing here, but it is an interesting thing to look at some stage. The war in East Africa is absolutely a fascinating war. Now, there were a number of different wars in Africa through the First World War, and actually, I suppose even prior to the First World War, in that the Ottoman Empire's possessions in North Africa had been whittled away and had been essentially annexed, but there wasn't sort of a legal background, there wasn't a treaty background to the annexations that were just in effect annexed. So before the First World War, Britain had already annexed Egypt. France had annexed Tunisia, and Italy had annexed Libya. And 100 years later, they're still interfering in Libya, but that's another day's work. But once the First World War started, there was a concerted attack on the German positions, even though it had been agreed in the Treaty of Berlin that if there was a war between the European powers, that it wouldn't affect the colonies wouldn't be affected. So there was the gentleman's agreement. We can fight amongst ourselves, but we're not going to involve the colonies. And the colonies, our positions will stay as was even at the end of the war. Well, of course, that agreement got forgotten about fairly sharpish once the war did start. And so, I said, Togo and Cameroon, they were overrun fairly fast. Cameroon became French, most of it did. Togo became British. German West of Southwest Africa took a while longer. It was a more complicated war. Eventually, it was taken essentially by the South Africans and the British, but obviously the South Africans were fighting with the British. And so that left German East Africa. And as I said, that war lasted until after, fortnight after Armistice Day. And it was a brutal war, an absolutely brutal war. Not in the sense of the Somme or those battles which were dug-in battles with millions of people chasing one way or the other and getting killed. But that it was a long, drawn-out guerrilla war fought over vast distances, like not only in what's now Tanzania, but across the adjoining countries, into Zambia, into Kenya. Part of it was in Burundi, part was in Congo. So like it was a very geographically spread out war. The Germans, in troop-wise, had about 40,000 troops, all told, between German and African troops. But they were under a general called General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. And some people think, sort of have a certain idealization of him because he did last through the war. He surrendered undefeated, and then he in the 30s he refused an offer by Hitler to become the ambassador to Britain. In the meantime, though, after the war, he also was the person who suppressed the second Spartacist rising in Hamburg in a very brutal fashion. But during this war, he basically operated a guerrilla warfare across thousands of square miles with a small army of troops, but he recruited over the time, or the Germans recruited, about 1 million laborers, African laborers. Now, on the other side, the British had about 135,000 troops, mostly Africans, some West Indies, some Indian, but some British, but mostly from Kenya, and some from what they called Rhodesia at the time, and they also recruited about 1 million African laborers, and the African laborers were really, and the African civilians, were the absolute and total victims of this war. Those who were working were badly paid, if they were paid at all. They were badly treated. They were badly equipped. I think if you're looking at that picture there, I'm not even sure if they all have shoes. They certainly aren't equipped, for logging great big pieces of timber and tree trunks around about. In that, I mean, that's not that sort of. I know health and safety regulations have changed quite a bit from 1914 to 2020, but I think you can see just as an outline there, that basically the state of equipment which African civilians were dealt with, and even though they weren't in the army, they were subject essentially to army discipline. When they died, there was no record kept of them. So there's no clear record of how many Africans died on either side, but it is reckoned that between 100,000 and 200,000 on both the German and the British side died during that war. And I say there's absolutely, but nobody knows, because nobody recorded it because they weren't worth recording. You know, so I think it just shows you what the attitude was to the to the applicants. Now, the other theatre of war for the British was against the Ottoman Empire. Now, most of us, when we were studying the First World War, whenever we studied it, we would have heard about the Dardanelles. Like up there is Gallipoli, and we would have known about that. You know, we would have listened to the song about, you know, in the Foggy Dew, but you know, about Suvla and all of that, and that's about the most we would have known. We would also have known by and large, I suppose, that the Anzacs were involved, the Australian and New Zealand forces. But of course, there were a lot more forces involved in that the bulk. And of course, the other thing we probably thought of is that when we would have watched Lawrence of Arabia and thought, oh yeah, and sort of Lawrence of Arabia and a certain number of Ottoman or of Bedouin horsemen sort of chased across the desert and sorted things out. Now, the Bedouin were involved, and they were treated at the end of the war. There's no doubt about that. But the vast bulk of the United Kingdom, of the British Empire troops in that theatre of war were Indians. Thousands, a huge number of the troops there were the Indian troops. And the main interest for England, for the United Kingdom, was what we now know as Iraq, what they would have known as Mesopotamia. Basically, if you're looking back to books or records at the time, you know, this would have been called Asia Minor. You know, for like if you're looking at contemporary sources, contemporary books. But you might be able to see that clear here. Constantinople, Istanbul, this jagged line here is the Baghdad Railway. So there was, as we know, a railway line to Istanbul. And now there's a railway line from Istanbul through down here to Kuwait, which in the paranoid view of whatever, maybe it wasn't paranoid, maybe it was perfectly rational, it gave a German Ottoman alliance access to the Gulf of Arabia, and therefore access, or much easier access, to interfere with India and with the British possessions in India. So when we look at the war here, it's nothing got to do with the Ottomans per se, and it's absolutely less to do with freedom for people who lived up here. It's got to do with making sure that there's no way for Germany to attack the Indian Raj, the Indian subcontinent, via a back door. And and we'll see at the end of the war how that fell out there. So that war, that went on, was a huge thing. Somebody's to deal with it now. When the war was over, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, all that, so didn't do that. But there was an initial treaty which eventually Turkey rejected. And it came down in 1922 to the Treaty of Lausanne. And that put Turkey back together again. It put Anatolia back into Turkey. And so Turkey's boundaries were agreed after that, more or less as we see them now. But the important thing was that Mesopotamia became separate. It became a British protectorate. And equally importantly, all of the German, either state or private, contracts for oil and for railways in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, became British, became all of the concessions which Germany had got, either private companies in Germany or the state in Germany had got in Mesopotamia, became British concessions and British possessions. So in that sense, at the end of the war apart from access to India, was, I suppose, the first. It wasn't a war for oil, it was certainly a peace deal for oil. That we can see. Because obviously prior to that, access to oil wasn't seen as a priority. So France was in a different position than Britain. It didn't have enough. It didn't have enough people in France to, especially to make up for the losses in the beginning of the First World War. But it also didn't have a large settler colonies like Britain did. So it didn't have the equivalent of Canada and Australia and New Zealand, where there were white French, descendants of white Frenchmen, actually being the majority of the population and running the country and sort of being in charge. That didn't exist. So they were in a much different position. So they, from much earlier on, they had to bring in troops from Africa, which they did. Like over the course of the war, they would have recruited over 1 million troops from their colonial positions. And now I am not going to attempt to pronounce this word. It means trooper, apparently, in French. And Senegalese I can manage. But I say, I'm not going to insult any French speakers or Senegalese people by my attempt on how to pronounce that. But again, the reason this is the name of this troop has again got to do with the racism of the French, because they would have looked at their African positions and they would have looked at certain tribes and said, oh, they're very effeminate, they're sort of blah, blah, blah. Senegal are warrior tribes. We'll recruit our soldiers from Senegal. Now, over the course of the war, they recruited from everywhere, but they still maintained sort of that overall fiction, and they still maintained the name of the regiment for all their African troops. I think it's quite interesting to know that even as you're recruiting them, you're still dealing with that level of, it's not even suppressed racism, it's just sort of slightly hidden racism. And like the English colonial troops, the French colonial troops also were in sort of second place, but they had to be brought to Europe and they had to be put in the front line because France didn't have enough soldiers. Now, there was a huge debate in France and in Britain about this because they saw a huge danger. If you brought colonial troops, African or Asian troops to Europe, and you told them it is okay to kill white people. Not only is it okay to kill white people, you have to kill white people, even if they're Germans. This then breaks down the mythology that the white person is automatically superior. And your reverence and your fear for white people goes. And what happens when they go back? Will they maintain the reverence and their fear of the colonial masters, or will they bring that attitude if I can shoot one white man, why can't I shoot another one? So there was a huge fear on the part of the colonial powers. And you can see it in the debates, you can see it in Parliament, you can see it, in the attitude of the generals. That the idea of bringing African troops to Europe, and essentially the Germans basically accused the French of breaking the rules of war by bringing African troops to Europe. And after the war, when France occupied the Rhineland, they put one of the Senegalese regiments as part of the occupation, which they did deliberately, to say not only are you subject to us, but you're subject to black troops. So it was part, essentially, of sort of a deliberate snub to the Germans after the First World War. They were sending in a black regiment, an African regiment, to be your masters. You're now so subservient, and that's I say that was just so. The French, also the French colonial troops, again had worse pay, worse conditions, and worse discipline, and a more severe disciplinary code than the white troops. But France didn't, France, apart from North Africa and Madagascar, also in Africa, they also had what they called French Indochine, Indochina, what we would call Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, that part of the world. Now, there were some Vietnamese troops brought over, but most of the persons they recruited from Indochina were laborers. They brought them in to work in farms, to work in the docks, and to work in factories. Again, thousands and thousands and thousands. Like in neighbors alone, probably 50,000 people from Vietnam and Cambodia brought in to work. And in one sense, it's peculiar that they became probably more militant than people who were in the army, because they learned how to strike and how to organize unions when they were in the big French factories, which had a tradition of unionism, which actually lived through the war. But so that's another. That was in. The other groups that were brought in by both Britain and France were the Chinese. Now, China was, in theory, independent, and it was neutral. But there were the concession ports, and part of the deal, part of the sort of what was operated by the forces in the concession ports, operating through local warlords, power brokers, and people smugglers and whatever else, was that about 100,000 Chinese laborers, mostly men, I think all men, were brought to Europe to work in factories, but also to work at the back end of the army. In other words, there would be people who would work in the machine shops. There would be people who would be working as sappers, digging trenches, digging latrines, clearing latrines, clearing shells, unexploded shells, bringing back bodies, burying parts of bodies. So not only had they been essentially hijacked, kidnapped, forced into forced labor in China, shipped halfway around the world, then they arrive in the battlefields of the Western Front mostly, and then are treated again like slaves. And I say they were with both Britain and France. Now, Africa, 1914. Actually, nice clear map. All the blue bits are France. All the red bits, United Kingdom. The green bits are Italy. The grey bits are Germany. And those two green bits, and there's little green bits stuck up here, and there should be a little green bit in that bay there, are Portugal. And this blue bit here is Ethiopia, which was free. And this is just the sort of what the population of them is, those countries are now. You can worry about that. This is a map of Africa, 1921. Unfortunately, it's not quite so colourful as the other one, but it's not that difficult to work out. France hasn't lost anything, except that it's gained Cameroon. Libya is still Italian. United Kingdom, Egypt, Sudan, Kenya. This is supposed to be a League of Nations protectorate, but it's essentially United Kingdom. And right down here. So basically, United Kingdom, Britain had an empire running right from the Mediterranean right down to the Cape, plus bits stuck over here as well. Portugal didn't move, so not one iota of Africa became free after the First World War. Like again in Ireland, we would have grown up with this notion of the freedom of small nations. Well, the freedom of small nations, didn't happen in Africa. We did have new nations created, new countries created in Europe, and Czechoslovakia came into being. Yugoslavia came into being. Albania came into being, or became more recognized. Poland got put back together again after being dismantled in, I suppose, in the Napoleonic War, but having pulled apart for a long time before that. And then you had, but like in colonial Africa, nothing changed. I don't have a proper map because of not having access to some of the maps I needed. But if we look at the Middle East, all that happened in the Middle East, again, was a change of master. Mesopotamia, Libya became British, Palestine became British, and Syria and Lebanon, and Jordan was sort of in the middle, became French. That became the French. So like nothing changed, and nobody. Despite the promises that were made, especially the promises that were made to the Palestinians and the promises that were made, to different Bedouin leaders over time, nothing happened in the sense of having got rid of the Ottoman Empire, for which nobody should shed any tears. That were the people who moved away from the Ottoman Empire in Asia, one iota better. Because even those countries that sort of became in theory independent were essentially protectorates and existed only because either France or Britain or both said that they could and that they would. And I say, like when we think again of the First World War, we think of the debates about poppies. But like, I'm sure poppies are important. Some people, every one of those poppies is supposed to represent one of the UK troops that died. There aren't many poppies for any of the civilians that died. There aren't any poppies for the Africans who died. There aren't any poppies for the Indians that died. There's no poppies for the Chinese laborers that died. And you'll be delighted to know I'm not going to sing it for you. But if anybody can sing anything before we finish off tonight, they should. Because this thing, all disasters, we're all in this together. Anybody who knows this song, Hanging on the Old Barbed Wire, will know. So they weren't all in this together. The generals were having a good time, while the poor private was hanging on the old barbed wire. So with that, I'll stop there. We've been on for long enough, and we'll take it from there. Kathy, if you want to walk from there.
That's great, Padraig. Thanks so much. I definitely learned a lot, and I have an undergrad in early modern history, and so little of that is taught, or maybe it's an indication that I was a bad student. I don't know, one or the other. But yeah, thanks very much. Do we have any questions from people who attended this evening? Feel free to use the raise hand function, or just unmute yourself and come in.
Hello, Sigrid from
Sigrid,
New
how are you?
York. Hi, thanks for inviting me. I just want to thank you. Today's our Thanksgiving, but luckily this was scheduled before our feast, and found it very interesting. Thank you so much. I pulled out a book on the pre-World War era that I'm going to read, that was sitting on my shelf collecting dust. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, Sigrid.
Thanks very much. There's also the chat function if anyone wants to post their questions in there.
So I think one thing maybe I didn't go into tonight, but just I think it's interesting as well. Is there's one thing that you sort of have to look at. You know, like when we learned like what caused the First World War, and it's the Sarajevo and the shooting, and whatever else happened. So it all snowballed, from Emperor, whatever, the Grand Duke getting shot down in Sarajevo. But I think you can Grand Dukes come and go, and I'm sure it would have been upsetting the Grand Duke having getting shot, but that was an excuse for war. Like the background to war, it was got to do partly with Germany and Austria feeling surrounded because of the different alliances that had built up. Because you had Russia on one side, and then you had traditional enemies, France and United Kingdom and Belgium, on the other side. So Germany, which is a newly emerging power, it had only united in 1870, feeling that they were being surrounded, militarily surrounded, and being cut off. And also then the established powers, basically it was more got to do with trade, and empire than with anything else. Because there was a huge, the German economy was making inroads into traditional markets, which especially the UK would have regarded as its own, sometimes in Africa, but also in South America. And there's some quite interesting articles about the attitude of British trade consuls, in Argentina and in Paraguay and places like that, where German ships are beginning to trade, beginning to take more trade, and German goods are breaking in. So whereas the Grand Duke being shot was an excuse.
We just have a question in here, Padraig. Sorry if I'm interrupting. Who does it serve today for us to learn about poppies in the Somme, but not learn about the First World War without learning about this colonial aspect of the histories of the soldiers?
Well, I think I don't think it does. I think learning a distorted version of history is probably worse than not learning history. In that if you learn something that's distorted, whether it's if you learn electricity that's distorted, you end up sort of doing great damage to yourself. So if you learn, I think, a distorted version of history, that the war was only about the Somme, that wasn't about, that there was no role for the colonies. It wasn't about colonies, and that I think it shows. I don't know, it's the writing of history, the rewriting of history. That it's. I think the fact that that's what we were taught, I think, tells us something. But it's certainly, from the point of view of history, and it's quite dangerous. But tradition, history is written by those who win, and within those who win, then it's whoever is the dominant class. So I think, even as the war was being fought, the war was sold to people on a particular basis. It was fought on a particular basis. The narrative afterwards was created on a particular basis, all of which were false.
I suppose, like, the symbolism of the, this, like, good soldier going to war, and the poppies and the loss that, like, collectively, so many people across the world experience, and the celebration of it today, I suppose, sort of, like, inspires a memory of, particularly of like my generation, obviously, that it's almost like mythic now, for people in their 30s to hear about, world wars, and the way they're presented to us through, I suppose, like, the American mass media and stuff like that, or like all mass media, this, like, different and special time when, people were valiant and brave, and harking back to that regularly, I suppose, still allows young men and women, thanks great equality, now we can go to war too. But it still allows, I suppose, like, it still allows for wars all over the world, and willing soldiers joining up, maybe.
I think it creates that. Undoubtedly, it creates a mythology.
And now it benefits, like, American capital or whoever's got.
Well, I guess it creates that narrative also that, like we were taught about, poor little Belgium, and the poor little, the Catholics in poor little Belgium. Presumably in Northern Ireland, they were talking about, the Protestant section of the population in poor little Belgium. Like, it was years later when I realized that Belgium had an absolutely massive empire. And not only did it have a massive empire, it had the people, their subjects in the Congo were treated absolutely appallingly, and even after the Congo independence, and right nearly to the present time, the level of interference by Congo or by Belgium in Congo is frightening. But their role in the Katanga and their role in the killing of Lumumba is underreported, but it's appalling. Does Owen want to get in there? Do I see his hand up?
Yeah.
Thanks, Padraig. Very interesting. I just wanted to know if you're aware of any accounts from African or Asian soldiers of their experiences.
I think there are now they are being recorded now, or being dug up now. It's only really recently that it's that they've entered mainstream. That whole subject has entered mainstream history. I know that David Olusogo has done quite a lot of work on it. There's another historian, Oliveti Oteto, has done some stuff on it. And there is an alternative history sort of bit on the BBC about basically Black history of the First World War. As far as I know, that there are also some some historians working in Africa, and obviously then you have the situation of African American soldiers in the American Army, which is a different day's work. But there isn't a lot, to my knowledge, but I mean, there certainly is some, like I presume again, part of the problem is that quite a lot of the soldiers, from these areas didn't necessarily read and write, so that therefore their stories, unless they've come down in the oral tradition, haven't actually come down, because again, like for example, the Senegalese regiments, when they came to France, when they came to fight on the Western Front, essentially they operated on a type of pidgin English or pidgin French, which was a mixture between their native dialect and French. So, like even within France, there was an effort made not to teach them French. Say rather than there was basically the idea was they'll have a lingua franca. They'll operate. We'll be able to give them orders. They'll understand the orders.
Yeah.
And if they're trying to report something back, we'll understand it.
Okay. Thanks, Padraig.
Padraig, it would be great if you if you any more of those accounts might come to mind, that perhaps you could post them in the event page on Facebook, and then other people could see them. Do you have any other questions, Kieran? Sorry, Liam.
Hi, hi, Padraig, and hi, Cathy. Thanks very much for the opportunity, and this was a very interesting discussion there. I was just wondering, I suppose in Ireland we have that situation where the men who fought in World War One were very much airbrushed out of history due to our revolutionary period, starting so soon after, and those men, their contribution didn't suit the narrative of I suppose of the independence of Ireland. I wonder, did the countries, did people from other ex-colonies that were going to become independent soon after, albeit maybe didn't become independent maybe until the 1960s, do those countries have the same kind of grapple with the history and the narrative, or is it only, let's say in our case, where independence was going to come so soon after the boys came home, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I suppose, again, you have to look at the three different armies that would have been part. Say, especially the French, I'm not too sure of. But if you look at the British, the United Kingdom Army, you had the white settler colonies, the Canadas, your New Zealand, your Australia, and South Africa, and their contribution was very much celebrated. And like you had Anzac Day, you have your war graves, your war memorials, all over the place. In India, not so much, but there is, and there was a memorial built by the Commonwealth Graves Commission they started in 1919, and they would have started with the Cenotaph in London, and then would have with Lutyens and moved on from there. So I think it was late 20, maybe 28, or maybe it might have even gone to 30 when they built a memorial, which again, as far as I know, is in Kashmir, which of course is disputed and in sort of military lockdown a lot of the time now. So it's not available to visit by a lot of soldiers. How the Indians themselves celebrated, I'm not too sure, because again, even as the war was going on, or certainly after the war, if you think of it, like the war had just finished in November, and then in March of 1919, you had the Amritsar massacre, just a peaceful. It wasn't even a protest; it was just a Sunday market, and so I think very much even though their whole process of moving towards independence wasn't an armed uprising rebellion, I think again the people who had been to war weren't. It wasn't seen. It wasn't sort of a major thing to put on your CV. That I'm an ex-soldier, and in Africa, I'm honestly not too sure. It goes back to the original question, I think, from Owen, was, is there some stuff? I think, again, there may be some monument to the King's African Rifles, but how well, the actual native troops and the families of the native troops who were part of that look up to it. I think the big problem for the African contribution is that so many of them are actually civilians. They weren't actually in the army. People who actually took the brunt, obviously not of the fighting, but of the effects of the fighting and of the preparation for the fighting and of the clear up for the fighting. So I think the fact that it was mostly civilians, civilian workers, like apart from the civilian casualties of war, of which again there's no clear, not only in Africa or in Mesopotamia, but even in Europe, there's no clear indication of the number of civilian casualties. It's sort of can be a bit worked out through looking at census of population, seeing how many did we start out with and how many have we finished up with. But that's a fairly inexact science,
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
Pretty mixed responses from everyone, to it. Maybe it benefited, Britain or Australia or Canada to sort of celebrate it in a way that it didn't some other countries.
Well, it probably did. In that, if you're saying, if you're trying to sell it to your highlands and islands, if you go to the highlands and islands, like every little village has its high cross and its war memorial, and you sound like, well, your great contribution. You can't say, well, like we're glad Scotland sort of contributed 50,000 troops, but point of fact is only piss off because considering India gave us 1.2 million. So I think it was very much from the point of view, even though they looked to the empire, and as they did in the Second World War for troops, it was very much a white man celebration, where it wasn't necessarily a white man's war.
Do we have any more questions now before we wrap it up?
I presume this will be available for people. What have asked me?
We're recording it, so we'll be posting it on our Facebook page, and also we'll share. There's in the chat box there. There's a Look Left article commemorating an Imperialist War. If anyone's interested in reading it, and we'll share that as well on the event page.
I was able to look at that YouTube thing as well, with the Workers' Party YouTube.
I will share it across all the platforms.
Right. So that's it. My pretty face is going to be immortalized. Fame at last after all these years. Okay. Well, look, I think it was important that we did that anyhow. And I see various members of the extended Mannion family are appearing there in the background. So it's always good that somebody loves me. My baby sister over there. So that's nice. So I think it was interesting.
I definitely learned a lot, Pork. Just having it all presented like that just is very useful, and also kind of sad just to see exactly how far the reach went and who it touched.
Well, if somebody does have the chance, if you like on YouTube, you will find actually a lot of very good versions of that song, hanging on the old barbed wire. So I say the idea that we're all in this together, like it's not all a long way to Tipperary and sort of Lily of the Lamplight, very fine songs as they are. That there was, like in a different debate, you could actually talk about the end of the First World War. Okay, so that say Russia left the First World War essentially because of mutiny. The Ottoman Empire again wasn't mutiny there, but both the German and the Austrians basically collapsed because of mutiny by their own troops, and before, like not long, like a few months before the end of the war, there was serious mutiny, even though not overall mutiny, by French troops. So like that whole, obviously that wasn't something that was celebrated by at the end of the war. Nobody wanted to say, but we actually surrendered because the troops started shooting the officers. It doesn't look well in ye old imperial history, does it? Okay.
Thanks so much for coming, everyone. And just to let you know that we have another talk coming up on the 10th of the month. And Ben Norton will be speaking to us about Latin America and US imperialism. So we've shared that on our Facebook page as well, and you'd be very welcome to join us again.
And what is Tara doing her talk? I know it's not we're doing it, but isn't Tara doing a talk from Trinity as well? So it is.
I would have to go and look for that, but it is on our Facebook page.
Yeah.
So,
Tara, if you'll mute yourself there, you'll tell us.
That's on Saturday. It's on Saturday at 7:30. So it's Engels Bicentennial. So.
There we go.
That's great.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone. We'll end it there, and hope to see you again before the end of the week.
Yep.
Bye.
Okay.